Hello, everyone. We're thrilled to have you all. And I'm Jeremy. As Martin said, I'm an engineering manager on the mobile team here at Betterment. And I'm going to talk to you about how Flutter transformed our organization. When I say talk, I actually mean share GIFs and low quality memes. Like this graphic, which is dedicated to our next speaker, Will, because he was repulsed by it. And you can probably see why I'm a manager and not a designer. So I'm going to talk about Betterment's decision to migrate their native iOS and Android applications to Flutter, which is a pretty straightforward statement, but the repercussions of that decision were significant. And I'm up here to talk about them because I hope the lessons from our journey can be helpful to you or your organization. So first, it's worth touching on the context and history that went into that decision. But ultimately, what I hope you'll take out of this talk is lessons from the challenges that we faced both as individuals and an organization, and more importantly, about the benefits that we've seen from our investment into Flutter. This topic happens to be of pretty great personal interest to me. As an engineer at my last company, I spent a lengthy period of time refactoring a legacy application, eventually either creating or incorporating 11 different internal frameworks and combining functionality from two completely separate applications. So that experience, and specifically that experience at that company, led me to create and give a talk in April of 2020 about empathy and legacy code. And the funny thing is the takeaway from that talk was to leave things alone. And yet I joined Betterment in April of 2020 after they had already decided to use Flutter and replatform their native mobile applications. And now here I am to talk to you about what a great decision that ended up being. So this is my quote from March of 2020, which, as you can see, has a bit of a different flavor than what I'm about to talk to you about tonight. I'm not exactly on an island in my distaste for rewriting things. Joel Spolsky, who created Trello, was the CEO of Stack Overflow for about a decade. He writes about software development on his website. He, unsurprisingly, also has some words about legacy code, which include this, which is the single worst strategic mistake that any software company can make is to rewrite code from scratch. So wait a minute, Jeremy, you just said that replatforming to Flutter was a great decision. It sounds like you're full of shit. Well, that's very rude. And second of all, these quotes don't quite encapsulate everything that I said in April of 2020. So while I did warn against the perils of a large rewrite back then, the following information is pretty much taken verbatim from that presentation. So though I'm ready to speak to the benefits of a rather massive undertaking to replatform our native iOS and Android applications to Flutter, I would be remiss and perhaps even reckless not to preempt that with some words of caution. So I mentioned that this was an investment that has paid off for Betterment. And fortunately, there were some very smart people, some in this room, who considered these very things before making that decision. So here's your disclaimer. Before you do this, make sure you have the following things. The biggest thing is buy-in. You need buy-in from product, from design, from engineering, because this initiative is going to affect everyone in big ways. You need buy-in from leadership, from as many people in your organization as you possibly can. It's inevitable that a change like this is not going to have universal buy-in, and that's okay. And I'm not going to talk about consensus building or the logistics of an undertaking like this, but you must have people higher up than you that will support you and make sure that this initiative is seen all the way through. You need to make sure that you have time, that you have space, that you have resources to do it. It's going to be hard to give an exact time frame on something of this scale, but you want to make sure that you're not going to get cut off before you start to see the benefits. Otherwise, you'll have wasted a ton of time and money and possibly even left yourself in a worse position than where you started. On the technical side, pretty much two sides to the same coin, but you need to have clear phases and an incremental approach, which I'll leave to Will to talk about in just a little bit. So I've spoiled the ending, right? Flutter was the right tool for Betterment. It could be the right tool for you. But we live in a world and an industry that is chock full of trade-offs. And these pitfalls might not be obvious if you've never been through something like this. And if you don't want to take my word from it, having been through it 2 times, presumably VGV has been through it more than that. And hat tip to them who've been working with Flutter before it was cool and helping companies like Betterment to build high quality Flutter applications at scale. They helped us with our pilot, and as much as VGV loves Flutter, they too have some words of caution. Flutter is a tool, and just like any other tool or framework, not every tool is right for every job. So you've heard a tiny bit about my backstory. You've gotten your warning about doing something like this. And now I'm going to take you back to 2019 and tell you about the state of mobile development at Betterment. Things were not great. We had inconsistent architecture and design patterns. And that doesn't just mean inconsistencies between iOS and Android. We had inconsistencies within each of those platforms. Beyond technical ones, we would find that the same features would work differently across our 2 platforms. And that's a challenging reality. Feature development and onboarding can be difficult enough at a large organization. And it's even harder when you have 5 different ways that you could build a feature. The power of linting is that it eliminates unimportant decisions and you can help avoid decision fatigue. Uniform architecture is that principle on steroids, and it allows your engineers to focus more on the important questions as opposed to having to bang their head against the wall thinking about how do I build this feature. I don't mean any disrespect to Ruby engineers that we have in the building or online tonight, but this was how our iOS application was described to me by one of our engineers. I don't know exactly what it means, but I know that it was 100% accurate and not in a good way. Beyond inconsistent architecture, I would just say that we had a great deal of unnecessary complexity, which just complicated things. Our native developer experience was pretty poor. We had long native build times, which is a thing, but ours were longer than they could or should have been, and that just ends up being a terrible drain on productivity. That's especially true when you don't have something like hot reload, and even small changes can take 10 minutes to verify. And then when you add to that the reality that you're not set up with any ability to test features in isolation, you're talking about hours a day for each engineer on your team that's being wasted. Historically, the mobile application lagged behind the web application in terms of functionality. Betterment was exclusively a web application when it started. So mobile was 20 yards behind the starting line, and we needed twice as many resources to support our iOS and Android platforms. And as you might be able to guess, we didn't have them. This is something that I'm kind of bucketing up as other responsibilities, things that go along with being a software engineer at an organization. The flip side of transitioning to being mobile first is an admission that you haven't made a sufficient investment in your mobile application or your team. So in addition to the woes that I've just enumerated, engineers had to handle things like a rather lengthy and manual QA process, on call, which for us means having the engineer on each team available each week to handle incoming questions and bugs. And for mobile, that meant 2 engineers on a given week so we could support iOS and Android. So you've got a small team and you add these responsibilities onto product and feature development and ongoing maintenance, and things are not looking so great. This quote was taken verbatim from one of the documents that was written around our Flutter pilot and migration that summarized all that history. It says, we need to make decisive change to help see that mobile development does not become a bottleneck for delivery of our strategic roadmap in 2020 and beyond. The reality that I just described is what led Betterment to the decision to investigate cross-platform solutions. I'm going to gloss over what was a pretty lengthy and involved process of conducting a Flutter pilot, making sure it met all of our requirements, that we had confidence that it would get us to the future that we wanted to see, that we had the business and product design and engineering buy-in, that we had time, we had an engineering plan. We had all of those things. It took a lot more than the 10 seconds that I just spent to talk about them, but we don't have all night. So on to the challenges that it presented for us in that undertaking. Just a quick overview of the how and when we did some of this, which I'll give you a bit of a breakdown later. But after the Flutter pilot, when we decided that this was a thing that we were going to do, we started with training for the entire mobile organization in May of 2020. It was a 2-week Flutter boot camp on Dart, Flutter, and Betterment's architectural decisions from our pilot. And from that boot camp, we started with a single team developing new features in Flutter so we could support that team and continue to work through any kinks without overloading ourselves. Other teams would continue with their native workflows, and once we had enough confidence, we would have everyone developing new features exclusively in Flutter. That was a good plan, but it presented some challenges as we figured out what it actually meant to transition 2 different platforms into Flutter. And I imagine that your team might run into some of those challenges as well. A few things that really stand out to me. Number one is imposter syndrome. Many people in this industry suffer from that on a good day. And well, everyone on the Betterment team was new to Flutter. So I had senior engineers with years and years of experience who would say to me almost weekly that they felt like a junior engineer again, like they were starting from scratch. That's an understandable feeling given the circumstances, but it's a difficult thing to grapple with when the people that you would typically expect to be providing mentorship and support are suddenly in need of a lot more of it. My response then and now is that learning any new language or framework as an engineer is never as hard as the last one, and the lessons that we learn in our careers translate and empower us to learn new things. But that perspective doesn't change the fact that the struggle is real for folks on this journey, and people who identified as an iOS or an Android engineer are going to feel like things have been reset to varying degrees. Another major and perhaps the biggest challenge that the team at Betterment faced was context switching. All new feature development was in Flutter, but we still had a large native code base to maintain. And this was a reality that we acknowledged up front, but it had a pretty severe impact, especially early on in our journey. This was something that I created when we were working on a migration of a feature to Flutter. That feature was presented from a native feature. So we were going native to Flutter. We then had to launch a native experience from Flutter. And that native experience was one of those situations where we found out that iOS and Android implementations differed. So something that we expected to be relatively straightforward ended up being an absolutely mind-melting experience. So context switching is pretty universally acknowledged as bad as a software engineer, and it's quite worse when you're trying to learn something new and end up straddling multiple worlds. You never quite get the focus time you'd like or that you need. I think the next kind of major hurdle for us was what this meant for our roadmap. We were just a lot slower up front. The team was still learning Flutter. We had to build out new components as we went. We would run into limitations of the things that we had already built. And then in addition to all that, we were looking to increase the scope of every single project because we wanted to couple a migration of an existing feature into Flutter wherever possible. And those feature migrations ended up being awfully challenging because we had little to no product or engineering documentation. And we often had people rebuilding feature they had no part in creating in the first place. So it was a time and labor intensive process that required a lot of input from product, from engineering, and from design. Which relates to the next point, which is this had a major impact on our workflow. We had to rethink how we collaborate. The Flutter, native Flutter scenario that I just described was a prime example. We couldn't just make assumptions about how things worked. We had to break down these pseudo walls that existed across our platforms and constantly be better communicators, both between engineers, and then we had to be better collaborators and communicators with product and design. We had to help them understand what we were going through. That sounds pretty awful. I don't know if I'll be here tomorrow. But as they say, the night is always darkest before dawn. And now with the bad out of the way, we can hear about how this investment has paid off, because it really has. The challenges that I just mentioned, all of them improved over time, and I can speak to each of them a bit. But the thing that I want to lead off with is the change to our developer experience, because we've saved hours a day for each engineer by streamlining feature development here at Betterment. And Flutter isn't the only framework that offers you hot reload, right? That was a significant improvement in how we ship features. But we're able to create something that we called Launchpad, where we can jump directly into a nested feature and streamline how we iterate on something that's in development. We gave ourselves the ability to do kind of pure Flutter feature development, where we avoid our long native build times, and we can just run our application in what we call standalone mode. Our onboarding process got significantly better. Our Flutter bootcamp turned into a nice set of onboarding lessons. And the same way that we get multiples on our engineering hours from working with a cross-platform framework, we also get more from a unified investment in our onboarding documentation. From my perspective as a manager, the two biggest wins are totally unrelated to the technical or product side of things here. And the first thing that I think that we've accomplished is a lot of personal growth for everyone on the team. I'm a big believer in helping to build T-shaped engineers. Accumulating a breadth of experience to go with your depth in certain technologies is important to me. And this migration provided a built-in opportunity to focus on that for an entire mobile engineering organization. So beyond having people learn Dart and Flutter and developing in Dart and Flutter, we saw a lot more cross-platform code review, often out of necessity, but it helped us all get comfortable being uncomfortable. And as a result, we all became better engineers for it. I don't always get to be very hands-on as a manager, but even I would hop in and review some Kotlin or Dart and really push the limits of what I was comfortable reviewing. Will, who you're going to hear from, shipped some massive changes that touch Swift and Objective-C, even though his background was as an Android engineer, because he had to dive into our iOS application to plan for an upcoming project. So not everyone needs to or will become polyglot all of a sudden, but a migration like this really opens up some of those doors for you and your organization. Beyond the personal side, we've also been able to build a stronger mobile team culture. There's always some level of camaraderie that exists between iOS and Android teams, but the reality is there's also a good amount of siloing that happens. We used to have platform-specific engineering forums, beta testing channels, and Slack engineering Slack channels. That's all been consolidated now because of Flutter. We have a single mobile engineering forum. We focus all of our energy on our Flutter application, and the collaboration now is happening across product teams as opposed to happening across product teams and platform teams. So we're all in it together now, and we're all better off for it. I laid out a few pain points from 2019, and we've been able to address every one of them in meaningful ways. Resourcing, even ignoring the whole aggressive hiring that's been going on here, we really do get double-ish the output from each engineer on the team from their feature development. But more important than that, each engineer's time that needs to get devoted to all those other responsibilities has been effectively halved. Thinking about when we take on a big project here, we used to need platform leads for iOS and Android. So planning a project meant 2 engineers for whatever the ramp up and investigation time period was. Now when we plan a project, it's a single engineer who has a better starting point because of the reduced complexity and consistent architecture that we've built. And then when it comes to executing those projects, something that would take 4 weeks on iOS and Android meant 2 engineers, so 8 engineering weeks. And now it means closer to 2 engineering weeks because we can have those same 2 engineers work collaboratively. And more important to me than the reduction in time means that we get to spend more time pairing and supporting one another, sharing knowledge and avoiding information silos. I mentioned on call before as a big responsibility here, where we would need 2 mobile engineers devoted to being on call each week. So for a team of 4 engineers, it meant you were on call every other week if you had 2 iOS and 2 Android engineers. Now it's once a month and it's way less painful. As you might expect, since we just did this migration and all, we've built ourselves a consistent architecture. So across features, we have a much better existence. And it's a single platform that we have to focus on. Our Flutter application is still relatively immature, so we do plenty of iteration on our solutions as we learn and we grow. But we have a much easier time being able to identify the latest and greatest patterns, identifying what needs to be updating, coordinating those updates across all the various teams, and also just sharing that information in a meaningful way across the organization. Context switching, especially after the release of our kind of home screen, our starting point in the application. After we released that in Flutter, for the most part, our engineers don't have to think about integrating Flutter features into a native application anymore. There's still times when we have to grapple with that native foundation or native features, but those instances are now way less frequent and much more isolated. So I also mentioned imposter syndrome being pretty prevalent across engineers on the team. And I guess now I'll just say it's back to what I'd call a normal baseline. And for most of the engineers, I don't think it really exists too much anymore. New engineers are able to come in knowing that they're embarking on this learning journey and they have a clear support system in place. And our existing engineers have had the time that they need to learn and to grow with our platform. So today we have more time to invest in things like ongoing maintenance work, platform initiatives to keep driving our mobile platform forward. And we see multiples on all of our investments in things like testing and QA. And then we're just a larger and more collaborative unit. The thing that we've given ourselves is velocity. We've just seen a huge uptick in our ability to ship code, and we've absolutely addressed the bottleneck that was called out in 2019. I've mentioned some of the steps that we took before, but kind of giving you a better look at how we actually got there. This is kind of a breakdown of our timeline from pilot to in January of 2020 to the launch of our home screen in Flutter, which happened in August of 2021. So I'd said that we had made real improvements on a lot of our pain points over time, but we also reached what I like to think of as terminal velocity when we got to the point where we could launch our home screen to Flutter, which, as I just said, was at the end of August. So depending on how you slice it, I would like to say that it took 15 months, and I don't feel like I'm being hyperbolic here, but in 15 months, we completed a total transformation of our mobile application and our mobile engineering organization. The way that we're able to build and release software is just unrecognizable to even a year ago. And Betterment is thinking mobile first in a way that treats both iOS and Android as first-class citizens. And that's largely because of Flutter. We haven't solved all of our problems, and none of this happened overnight, but the challenges that my team and Betterment are facing today are just different and frankly feel a little less terrifying than the ones that we were facing back in June of 2020. Beyond being more manageable, we have more time to continue to address our challenges head on. So things like improvements to our testing period, to QA, to our release cycle, to thinking about how we coordinate APIs with our full stack partners better. There will always be challenges as an organization grows, and those challenges will evolve over time. But Betterment is in a significantly better position today to be able to address those things and get more from each of those investments. And that's largely a result of the impact that Flutter has had on our team here. It's kind of an afterthought, since my main concern as a manager is the people on my team. But I'm happy to say that the new reality has also made my life easier. It can be hard to scale my time as the team grows, but all of those cross-platform benefits apply to me as well, and I'm able to be more impactful and more effective as a manager. I've got fewer platforms where I have to understand the product and the technical limitations. It's easier to support engineers planning projects when it's focused on a single platform, and conversations with product and design have been streamlined. Pretty much everything we do today is just less complex, As a result, we're creating high quality features in a fraction of the time. And we're successfully running ahead of our full stack teams here at Betterment for probably the first time in Betterment's existence. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And now it's time for another shameless plug. I hope that the present and the future that we've built for ourselves here on the mobile team at Betterment sounds exciting. We really do have an incredible group of people. So if you'd like to join us on our mission to make people's lives better, we're hiring and a lot more. So thanks for coming out.